Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're joining us for this explainer today. If you really want to wrap your head around today's geopolitical headlines, you absolutely have to look at the deep, cyclical nature of Russian history and statecraft. It's like a giant puzzle. Today, we're diving into some fascinating source material that shows how the autocratic Russian state breaks down, only to be reborn in a slightly different form, time and time again. By looking closely at the last 30 years through this specific lens, we're going to uncover exactly how a system goes from an illusion of democracy right back into a centralized autocracy. Let's get started. Okay, let's dive into this with a clear roadmap of what we're covering. We're going to hit 6 key areas. First, the illusion of 1991. Then, chaos and the oligarchs, followed by Putin's power vertical. After that, we'll look at weaponizing the Soviet past, the rebirth of Homo Sovieticus, and finally, the clash with the West. Part 1. The illusion of 1991. Now, to really understand this, we need to completely challenge the common Western narrative about the fall of the Soviet Union. Did democracy ever really win in Russia in 1991? It's a provocative question, right? In the West, we have this mental image of massive, triumphant crowds tearing down the old regime in this glorious democratic revolution. But the source text paints a totally different picture. What happened in 1991 was essentially an abdication of power by the Communist Party. There wasn't this huge, organized civic opposition ready to take the reins like we saw in places in Eastern Europe. Actually, during the famous August push, it was just a tiny ragtag group of maybe a few thousand people defending the government building in the rain. And get this, the rest of Moscow basically went about its normal day. Reporters at the time even noted there were more people waiting in line at the new McDonald's than at the barricades. So the crucial point is perfectly captured right here. By 1994, just 3 years later, highly trusted Levada polling data showed that a mere 7% of Russians viewed the downfall of the Soviet regime as a democratic victory. Just 7%. The vast majority of people actually saw it as a cynical power struggle among the elites or as a profound tragedy with terrible consequences for the country. So there was no widespread democratic awakening. Instead, there was just a massive vacuum. Which brings us to part 2. Chaos and the oligarchs. Let's look at the catastrophic economic and social disaster that followed this illusion of democracy. That vacuum of the early 90s led straight into a nightmare for the average citizen. In 1992, the government introduced economic shock therapy, instantly lifting price controls. The result? Absolutely skyrocketing inflation. To try and jumpstart capitalism, citizens were given privatization vouchers to buy shares in state companies. But think about it. Most folks had zero idea what a share even was, and they were quite literally starving. So they sold these vouchers just to get basic food or a bottle of vodka. Meanwhile, the old communist elites, the ones who actually knew how the system worked, exploited legal loopholes. They used state bank loans to buy up those vouchers and grabbed massive state enterprises for literal pennies. It was brutal, creating a desperate moral vacuum for the Russian people, who understandably started calling this new democracy a shitocracy. All of this chaos culminated in the defining economic scandal of the decade, the 1995 Loans for Shares scheme. President Boris Yeltsin's government was completely broke and facing a really tough re-election campaign against a surging communist party. So, to get cash fast, his team struck a deal with a handful of tycoons. These businessmen gave the government loans, and in exchange, they got temporary, controlling shares in Russia's absolute crown jewels. We're talking massive state oil and mining companies. Now, everyone knew the government was going to default on those loans, which permanently enriched this new class of ultra-wealthy oligarchs. While the scheme did fund Yeltsin's re-election, it effectively handed the real power of the state over to a few wealthy individuals. The country was basically in danger of breaking apart into private fiefdoms. Moving on to part 3, Putin's power vertical. With the state fracturing, the Russian security services, the FSB, decided they needed a new savior to step in and rescue the country. They maneuvered a relatively unknown official named Vladimir Putin into power. And it's fascinating to see how his public image was carefully curated to be the exact opposite of Boris Yeltsin. Look at the contrast. Yeltsin was seen as chaotic, sick, heavily associated with the humiliating decline of the 90s, and infamous for his heavy public drinking. Putin, on the other hand, was presented on television as sober, clean-cut, highly competent, and fiercely loyal to the state, thanks to his KGB background. For a population deeply traumatized by years of chaos, this image of stability was exactly what they were craving, even if they had no idea what his actual policies were going to be. Well, once he was in power, Putin wasted absolutely no time centralizing authority to eliminate any breaks on his executive power. He established what he called the power vertical. Basically, he abolished the public election of regional governors, which meant Moscow would now just appoint them directly. He also streamlined the political party system, essentially turning the national parliament, the Duma, into a rubber stamp for his presidential decrees. All of this was done in the absolute name of state security and order. And this brilliantly illustrates how the Kremlin justified this massive authoritarian shift. They coined this highly Orwellian term, sovereign democracy. It was crafted by Putin's chief advisor Vladislav Surkov, and it meant that Russia was completely free to choose its own managed political system while utterly rejecting Western definitions of liberal freedoms or human rights. So, under sovereign democracy, you still hold elections, but the results are managed and decided beforehand by the state. And if the West criticized it, the Kremlin would just dismiss it as foreign meddling in their internal affairs. Let's go to Part 4, Weaponizing the Soviet Past. Here we see how the regime relies not just on force, but on actively rewriting history to maintain its control. To keep this new power vertical strong, the regime realized they had to control the historical narrative. Take a look at these actual guidelines for high school history textbooks issued by the presidential administration back in 2007. They evaluate historical leaders purely on whether they strengthened the state's centralized power. It's kind of absurd, yet incredibly effective. Stalin is rated good simply because he strengthened vertical power, completely ignoring the horrific, massive human cost. Khrushchev is bad for weakening it. Gorbachev and Yeltsin, bad for destroying the country. And, no surprise here, Putin is rated the best because he strengthened vertical power while allowing private property. They are literally teaching generations of kids that state supremacy is the only real measure of a good leader. But it definitely didn't stop at school textbooks. The state launched a really aggressive legal campaign against any anti-patriotic elements that dared to expose the historical crimes of the Soviet regime. They passed the Foreign Agents Law, using old Stalin-era terminology to silence NGOs. They raided and eventually forced the closure of the Memorial Society, which was an archive dedicated to uncovering Stalin's repressions. They even went so far as to imprison independent historians on fabricated charges. People like Yuri Dmitriev, who had bravely uncovered a mass grave of 9,000 victims executed back in 1937. And finally, they actually criminalized spreading what they deem false information about the Soviet victory in World War II. The message here was crystal clear. The state owns historical memory. This brings us to Part 5, Rebirth of Homo Sovieticus. We really have to ask, has this massive state-sponsored propaganda campaign actually worked on the Russian mindset? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the jaw-dropping television polling data it shows, acting as proof of these reviving Soviet mentalities. This is from a hugely popular Russian TV show called The Court of Time. Millions of people watched historical events being judged in a mock trial, and then they'd call in to vote. When presented with the facts of Stalin's brutal collectivization policies that literally starved millions to death, a staggering 78% of the viewing audience voted that these actions were justified as a terrible necessity for industrialization. Only 22% considered them a crime. That is a stunning indicator of how deeply the acceptance of state violence has taken root again. And you have to see this phenomenal statistic from that very same program. 94% of the audience agreed that the Soviet personality was a real historical accomplishment to be proud of, not just some myth. When sociologists started tracking Russian mindsets in 1991, they honestly expected the compliant, authority-accepting nature of the Soviet citizen to just kind of fade away naturally over time. But instead, the exact opposite happened. This totally proves the source text's core thesis, Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man, didn't die out at all. He was successfully reborn and nurtured right under the Putin regime. Finally, Part 6, the clash with the West. Because once an autocratic state successfully consolidates all its power internally and arms its population with this aggrieved nationalistic history, that energy inevitably explodes outward into global conflict. Let's move to and see how this builds along this timeline. After the Cold War, NATO and the West operated on the assumption that they had won and were providing protection to newly independent states by expanding eastward. But over in Moscow, this was viewed as an offensive, deeply humiliating betrayal. In 1999, NATO intervened in Serbia without UN backing, which Russia saw as encroaching on its sphere of influence, and admitted 3 former Soviet satellite states. By 2004, NATO had expanded right up to Russia's borders. This growing tension culminated in 2007 with Putin's blistering anti-West Munich security speech, where he warned that Russia would push back. And sure enough, just a year later in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia specifically to permanently block its hopes of ever joining NATO. To justify intervening in foreign sovereign states, Putin adopted a 19th century imperial ideology during his third term, the concept of the Russian world, or Ruski Mir. This is a pan-Slav ideology, asserting that Russia isn't just a nation-state, but a supranational civilization. It claims Russia has a sacred historic mission to defend traditional Orthodox values and Russian-speaking populations, even if those people are citizens of other sovereign countries. It became the ultimate ideological weapon used to challenge the borders that were established after the Soviet collapse.
So we've watched the state collapse, seen a chaotic vacuum create an authoritarian savior, watched history get completely rewritten to justify absolute power, and seen how internal control inevitably morphs into external aggression. It's a staggering, repeating historical loop we've just analyzed, which leaves us with one deeply provocative question to ponder. Are the West and Russia doomed to repeat this cycle of state collapse, autocratic rebirth, and inevitable collision forever? It's a lot to think about, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring the source materials we use today, because understanding this cycle really is the only way we might ever hope to break it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.